I'm in management consulting. I'm a principal with Thornton. And years ago, I was assigned to a client that, within their asset management division, who had issues with their fleet program or the property program. They were walking in new to the division, and they needed a smart management consultant to come in and help assess it. And that really started my journey in asset management, seeing how you can make such a significant impact with a client. And this was within the federal government. And I saw when you change the tangible artifacts on the ground and the assets that are being utilized to, in this case, achieve the mission, you can really affect people's lives. You can affect the world, and really gained a passion for asset management as a result, and started tying those pieces together and applying it in different places, and watching and seeing the impact for the general public, the private sector, healthcare. It's just really amazing the reach that you have in the asset management community. So that was how I got into it.
How did you find out about ISO 55,000?
Oh, it's a great question. So a little bit of luck where we were one of my colleagues was at a conference and had met Jack Kelly, who was at a similar conference, and I think they were both waiting in the hall for a session to start, and struck up a conversation. And Jack quickly introduced. I mean, you got to give Jack credit. Someone who can introduce 55,000 to, and this person was not an asset management practitioner, and get them to become a believer within minutes.
That's so our Jack.
Yeah. Jack met my colleague and said, "Hey, you need to meet Moshe. He leads our asset management practice." This was years ago now, and I think you'll share common beliefs on how to improve asset management in the system. So it was that introduction, and then integrating into Asset Leadership Week, where I met a lot of people with common thoughts. So as I mentioned before, I'm a principal at Thornton. I manage our asset management solutions, and what that is essentially our solution set within the public sector. So asset management in private sector finance is an entirely different story. We're talking about physical assets here, of course. And it's all our services focused within the facilities, property, even digital asset environment. So I lead teams across the federal government, from civilian to defense and intelligence, to be able to provide services that improve asset management. And at times it's helping clients, well, I should say it's always helping clients think through asset management in terms of ISO 55,000. At times it's tactically helping them develop new technologies to better manage assets, data analytics, supply chain management, vendor management. So I oversee the development of our new solutions, our teams, and then ensuring that we can continuously serve our clients well and bring them the best services and across the federal sector.
Well, that explains why you jumped into the National Asset Leadership Strategy so quickly and so forcefully. You understand its value. So why don't you explain to people how the National Asset Leadership Strategy is developing now? There's quite a history, but where is it as of our meeting earlier today?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll give 30 seconds on the history, and this has to do with the perception that we as asset management practitioners, have in the world. We walk around with asset management goggles on, right? Wherever we go, we start to see things on how the assets are depreciating before our eyes or being invested in, right? We drive over a road and we're wondering how long it's been there, when the refresh rate is, so on and so forth. So when we started the NALS, the National Asset Leadership Strategy, over a year now, it was really with the understanding of the importance that asset management has on achieving national objectives, right? And helping the country and the United States bring together the assets and industries and private and public sector in a way that achieves, national objectives, national asset management objectives as well. So, our NOWS One effort was about, launching ISO 55000 and its relationship with national asset management. It's really an educational process. And that was, I think, very successful. We had a great review from Bloomberg, and it was met with a lot of positive, reception at the Hill. But the question was, now what, right? So what do we do with this knowledge? The ISO 55000 exists, but what does that matter? So NOWS 2 is essentially the so what, right? It's taking the principles of ISO 55000 and focusing them on sector-specific areas so that we can provide actionable decisions to important constituents. And those constituents may be policy, they may be the general public, private, public sector. So it's just, it's essentially step two. And the so what? What do we do now knowing that ISO 55000 can make a significant impact on the national economy, on the health and safety of the United States, on disaster preparedness, right? I think the first part is making sure that we have a diverse constituency that's contributing to the development of national asset leadership strategy. So breaking it apart into focused areas like sectors, and then ensuring that there's representation from within that sector, whether it's academia, private sector, and public sector, is the first part, right? Identifying who are the right individuals that could provide input that matter, that will result in actionable decisions. And then the next piece is creating that framework, really developing the questions that help guide a small user group or a team to impart their knowledge, right? Their perspectives on why it matters, why their sector matters, whether it's the energy sector or the water sector, and what is the need, right? That starting with that problem statement, what are the problems that exist within this sector? And I'll be talking about law enforcement, and we'll get into federal law enforcement. We'll get into that in a bit. And then determining how you can use the construct of 55,000 to be able to improve that sector. It's thinking in terms of the attributes of 55,000 with, data, metrics, risk, vision, value, things of that nature. I think what the NOWS is doing is allowing us to think beforehand of, what are the changes necessary, as we move into 2021, and, address institutional problems that have existed in the asset management environment, right, for some time. We're in a strategic pause. Well, I call it a strategic pause, but this is the big pause, right? With COVID-19, people are at an inflection point. And just naturally, due to the cyclical nature of administrations and changes, this is the time where no matter what political parties in the White House come 2021, you start over, right? There's another 4 years of executing upon a strategy. So at this point, if we're talking about the NOWS now and taking advantage of that strategic pause to think of how do we apply the best practices in 55,000 to line up any transition to be effective in 2021, then we're using time wisely, and I think effectively given where we're at. Late last calendar year, we were able to bring together stakeholders who, at all levels of the organizations hadn't really been able to work with each other on the level that they wanted to, or they can, just due to time and institutional constraints of agencies. So,
what kind of stakeholders?
Yeah, so we stood up a federal law enforcement asset management working group. And it's essentially asset management practitioners from across federal law enforcement agencies who
Such
are,
as,
such as we had representation from ATF, ICE, CBP, DHS, or rather, Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, Department of Justice, Federal Bureau
FBI
of
too,
Investigation.
right?
I'm sorry?
FBI?
Yes, FBI too.
Yeah. So just so people understand the type of stakeholders. Okay.
Yeah, and it's a diverse group of stakeholders with very different missions, even though they all, operate in a law enforcement environment between Department of Justice and Homeland Security, and as well as agriculture, right? Forest Service, Forest Service, I know has a law enforcement arm. And what we've done and what I've been able to see, being at Thornton for 14 years and working in this environment, were common problems that existed, or that exist rather, for many of these organizations. And we coalesce them together so that practitioners at the same level can meet one another in an environment where we're discussing, asset management best practices. And we had speakers at our event, which were fantastic, that were able to, bring real life examples as well as show, what technology, what's the evolution of asset management innovation that can be brought into the federal law enforcement arena, given the unique aspects of their missions. And, one thing that's extremely unique that the federal law enforcement asset management community has been facing is, for years, the idea of resiliency and agility, right? The lives, the operations of federal law enforcement agencies change, rapidly across geographies, across seasons, at any given time. So asset management,
Wow.
yeah, I mean, think about it. I mean, asset management has to be extremely dynamic to be able to respond to changes that are occurring, and those changes can be, based upon environmental factors like a hurricane. I, lived through Hurricane Andrew back in the early '90s in South Florida, and there were significant humanitarian as well as law enforcement concerns when all of the power goes out, right? All of your
Yeah.
infrastructure shuts down, and you need to make sure that basic operations can occur, and that things are safe, and the general public is able to live their lives. So it's always been a very dynamic environment, which is why I love operating and working with it. And fantastic clients that are just used to change. And as a change maker, and as a management consultant, that's the world I live in, right? Nothing is static.
Yeah.
And
Right.
the idea of ISO 55000 that creates the framework in which you can manage change, you can prepare for change, it makes complete sense. So we brought these stakeholders together. They were able to meet each other, and an immediate benefit was collaborate through informal connections as well as formal connections, and and then ostensibly look towards making a more concerted effort to integrate 55,000 principles, and we see that happening. So
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Well, we talked about certain Departments of Homeland Security agencies have started to adopt ISO 55,000 principles, right?
Awesome.
Yeah, and we've seen presentations on the implementation of metrics-based decisions, data-based decisions, looking at the entire ecosystem. I think DHS has come a long way in being able to have coordinated efforts across diverse stakeholders like FEMA, as well as CBP or Coast Guard or FPS. Right? These are all very dynamic and diverse constituencies. So, as as 55,000 knowledge has made its way across the federal government, it's being adopted and then integrated into operations slowly, right? It is a big beast, and it's a process, but at least it provides that vision. What I would guess, based upon the discussions that we had at the end of last calendar year, is greater collaboration and best practice sharing in the areas that are relevant to ISO 55,000 and strategic asset management planning, right? So what are those areas on risk, on common metrics, on standards, taxonomy? I think we're going to see more of that communication and then benefits being achieved across stakeholder groups within the community. So that's what I will guess, because I know that they've individually have come along since we last met. And there will be a lot more of that probably best practice sharing and continued collaboration and communication. That's just my guess. I think, and I'll speak generally, even beyond federal, because I have seen a bit in the private sector healthcare as well as state and local. The trend that we saw with personal protective equipment, or PPE, initially when COVID broke out, was a bit of trying to understand what was the infrastructure, what were the data, what were the processes in place to first account for the PPE, right? So that you can ensure you knew how much you have. And then how does the supply chain look? What is the vendor base? How do I get PPE on contract? What are some of the holdups as a result of borders essentially shutting down due to COVID-19 health risks? In some cases, obviously opening back up later, but at a slower throughput. So in the first part of this pandemic, there was just trying to get the lay of the land, understand what systems and data and processes exist. Then we saw, basically an understanding of where everyone was at. And, many agencies in the federal government were able to quickly get their resources coalesced together and, establish processes, analytical capabilities, forecasting capabilities, and vendor relationships fairly quickly for those that were collaborating, right? Which was very interesting. I think as we move into the fall, and we can expect an additional uptick as just a result of we're getting to seasonality. That's a guess, right? I'm not in the healthcare sector, but that's what the literature is saying. There'll be less of trying to get a bearing of, how are we managing this as asset management practitioners, because we now know in many cases, there are processes in place, and there'll be, I think, further investments or resources made to ensure that the supply chain of PPE is, better sought out, better managed, and more collaboration occurring between organizations. And I think that's the piece that we're at, right? So during the height of the pandemic, at least from the initial outsets, people were trying to understand and gain resources so that they can complete, the healthcare jobs or the missions within the federal government or state and local services. There was a little bit of now rebaselining and understanding this is actually what we need, because in some cases we figured out we can operate in a remote environment. We don't need to all be in this building. Therefore, we all do not need this amount of PPE. Let's adjust that factor. Let's order more or order less, and allow for redistribution of resources across the supply chain. So I think that all of that is coming together now, and will be factors that we'll have to deal with as we come into the fall, but thinking through those problems.
Not very passionate on the subject, are you?
It's a lot of great people working on it, and I know I can't tell you how many hours and weeks, nights and weekends people have spent, just making sure that everyone is safe. And people have really sacrificed health, family, and a lot of sacrifice just to be able to help others. So, you know, there's so many aspects to that question. And I'm not an accountant, so I'm not, you know, I do work for an accounting firm, but I'm not a CPA. I will put that out up front. But you know, one of the biggest issues that I've seen across client bases is that asset management systems and financial management systems are different, and clients are essentially running their assets in one system, and it's not tying to the financial management system of record. So when you're going through the inventory or you're trying to depreciate assets with ease, it's extremely challenging, and it's extremely challenging to account for on an annual basis, because of what is a technology system issue, partly, right? So there is significant opportunity to improve the accounting of assets based upon some technological improvements and standardization of systems in and of themselves and the processes by which those systems exist. And I can tell you that, you know, money is poured into audit remediation efforts, you know, across the United States because of that fundamental issue of technological systems not talking to one another. So I think that, you know, this question also hits upon how the assets are being managed and how asset management offices work with the finance offices, typically separate, to account for these assets on the books. And it's extremely challenging for many stakeholders who don't have that unified system. And I'm not plugging any specific software. There are great softwares out there. There are great systems. That alone does not solve it. The accounting is necessary to make it beneficial. And the processes in themselves, but we have to recognize the problem. I think that there is a rare moment where asset managers or people that work within asset management have the ability to shine during COVID-19. And it's one of the most, you know, beneficial things that I have done in my career has been during this period, where we've been able to help through asset management practices, through 55,000, through our knowledge of infrastructure and analytics, field PPE, for example, to the places that need it most at the time that they need it. So that's one answer. The second piece to that goes back to the agility and the resiliency that's necessary. So asset management itself will have to become a more resilient and nimble planning operation, right? Oftentimes we think of 30-year capital plans, which are necessary, right, to make large-term investments and receive payback. But we also have to take into account the changing and dynamic nature that COVID-19 has made people aware of. And if you've worked at all within the federal government for the past decade, you would know that it has become less of a fluid environment, right? Government shutdowns, you know, operating on continuing resolutions, the need to become agile, to respond to how the operations have been undertaken within the asset management environment has become a necessity, not a choice. So I think that's going to be one of the primary changes to the asset management practice, is the ability to be more agile, to think in scenarios rather than in long-term, you know, finite plans. Makes sense?
The interesting thing about COVID is that it's done it on a national and global level.
Right.
We have been the situational requirements for that agility, like you mentioned, Sandy, and, you know, just today, Laura, you know, we're seeing the fires and the floods, but this is getting us a national focus. And it's bold to say it, but I think the Asset Leadership Network has an answer for how to proceed into this new world. And that's through a systematic, standardized approach to asset management. So,
well, Mike, and I would also say, and this was amazing during the webinar we did with the healthcare facilities that were, you know, there were constituents located in California, and we were able to quickly share best practices related to asset management, things that we're doing here on the East Coast that people could start applying tomorrow, right? So I think ALN provides that collaborative environment where individuals can share best practices, you know, can collaborate on resourcing effectively in this environment, and that says a lot about the organization. It's amazing because the infrastructure bills on the Hill tend to be the most bipartisan bills that are put out there. So if there's any area within industry that you can reach common ground, it's assets, right? It's asset management. Now, I'm sure there's different variants of which asset you're talking about or what to focus on, one item at a time. But I think that the work through the National Asset Leadership Strategy, the NALS, where we're talking about how do you put a prioritization methodology in place that is not based upon, necessarily subjective measures, and those can be political or they can be otherwise, but based upon what's necessary to achieve national objectives. That's how you get to a nonpartisan approach, and it's putting that accountability, that methodology in place where you eliminate the subjectivity.